All right, this is Bill Carmody, and my guest on today's show is Tim Samuels. He is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, broadcaster, and journalist. His name is well known in the BBC in the UK, and he's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, and GQ. Simply put, he's a badass who just finished writing a book called Future Man, How to Evolve and Thrive in the Age of Trump, Mansplaining, and Me Too. Welcome, Tim. It's an honor and a privilege to have you on the show.
Thank you. I've never been called a badass before, so I've lost my badass virginity with you, Bill.
Beautiful. I'm glad. Anytime someone can lose their virginity with me, I'm always happy. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. So being a man today, it's really interesting. Being a man today is harder than ever. Why is that?
I think it depends. Ends meet is living paycheck to paycheck, who's got skills for a job that doesn't exist anymore, or has moved to China, or is about to be automated out of existence. Things probably aren't so great for you now, or if you're one of the people who's on the wrong end of the justice system, it's not great for you now. So I think one of the things that we have to deal with at the moment is kind of break down the idea that all men are the same and that we're kind of a big mass, when in fact how things are going for you now is largely dependent on where you kind of fit in the pecking order, and the economy, how things are going for you, and whether you've got a job and feel value and meaning or not. And that tends to get overlooked when people say, oh, men are dominant, everything's fine for them, when in fact for a lot of guys, or a lot of guys in women's lives, whether it's sons, husbands, fathers, brothers, things aren't all kind of cookies and cream.
You know, I some of the statistics to that end that you provided in your book were staggering to me, and so I'd love to just sort of speak into them, and then we could talk a little bit about them. Men are 3.5 times more likely to commit suicide than women. The prison population is 93% male. 80% of children excluded for school behavior problems are boys, and 80% of couples at fertility clinics, or at least some fertility clinics, are requesting girls. 25% of eating disorders are male, and most go undiagnosed. And who knew that there was such a thing as pre- and postnatal depression for men? This truly feels like more of a global epidemic.
Or curiosity even. Like people shrug and say, oh, men have got it fine. What's there to complain about? I think also it's not seen as men's time. You know, we're in a kind of Me Too environment, and rightly, you know, there are issues which are being addressed now and abuses of power which are long overdue, but it's not an either or. I don't think it's about respecting women at the expense of men or vice versa. I think men and women can both progress, be listened to more, and ultimately have better lives. So it's not a gender battle. This isn't at the expense of women, but it's just saying, actually, when you take a step back and you look at those statistics, this is probably a crisis. And this is a crisis in the US, in the UK, and across the world. And it's a crisis which you see fueling radical politics, not just arguably in our respective countries, but, you know, in places like Brazil and parts of Europe as well, and in the Middle East. When men aren't feeling like men, that's a pretty toxic political situation, and it's ripe for the populists to come along and exploit that.
Well, I'll speak into my own experiences. I am an international keynote speaker, and I have become much, much more sensitive of anything that I say on stage that has anything to do with gender. And I'll tell you, it's a challenge, not because I don't want to be my authentic self, but because there's such a reaction. It's almost like a boiling point that the slightest thing can be taken out of context and it can explode. So one of the things I'm curious about in your research and your studies and looking at all of this is, how can men still be men without being called out by women? Because oftentimes it's not even intentional that way. They're not trying to do anything to put a woman down or to be gender biased, and yet something they say can absolutely flame up, and suddenly they're part of a hashtag.
Yeah, I think a lot of men, especially those who work in corporations, live in paranoia of saying or doing the wrong thing, of making a joke that is misconstrued. I mean, compliments, I mean, they've long gone. I mean, people won't give, forget it. You know, and I'm aware of that. You know, in some ways it's a good thing that we think twice before making a joke, and previously that joke may have been a bit oafish and insensitive. But I think like to take humor out of the workplace or your interactions, I think is a sad loss. You know, things have got to be calibrated, but we don't. You know, in this country, we had the case of a Nobel Prize winning cancer scientist who was called Sir Tim Hunt. The guy, I think, was in his early 70s, who made essentially a bad dad joke at a conference about female scientists. You know, it wasn't malicious; it was a dad joke, and for that he was pilloried and was stripped of his academic posts before there'd even been an inquiry. And here's someone in his 70s whose work for cancer cures had won a Nobel Prize, who gets hung out to dry without an inquiry for a bad dad joke. And when you hear something like that, I think many a guy just self-censors and thinks it's not even worth making a joke. It's not worth it. So I think that's an overcorrection. You know, there's no place for bullying. We've got to be respectful, and I think guys have learned a lot over the last few years. But I agree, gender is a minefield, and you know, I'm acutely aware of that, where things, you know, especially in the social media age, can be blown out of context. That often you think it's not worth a fight. I'm just going to keep stum.
You know, it's interesting because one of the things that you talk about in your book, and I really appreciate it, is this concept of good masculinity and the idea of that, you know, not all masculinity is wrong or off or anything. So we're seeing this pendulum swing back the other way. But where do you see evidence of positive masculinity as you sort of look out into the industry right now?
Yeah, I think you see it with a lot of fathers, really. You know, going back a generation or so, dads were emotionally quite unresponsive, generally barely spent time with their kids. I think there's been a sea change there. I think guys are much more hands-on, they're much more emotional, they're much more expressive, and they want to spend time with their kids. And that's much more rewarding for them, for their relationships, for the kids. You know, it's a win-win. So that feels like an expression of good masculinity at the moment. You know, it's about being with your tribe. You know, it taps into kind of these base instincts that we might have, but in a positive way. You know, it's not all about toxic masculinity at the moment. It's about men who are better fathers, and also, I think, increasingly willing to admit vulnerabilities. You know, especially around mental health. There is less of a need for men to have a stiff upper lip and be kind of the mute cowboy or jock who everything's fine, but to say, you know, I'm not feeling $1 million, and that doesn't make me any less of a man, and I might get a bit of help, but I'm still a man. So I think around emotional expression, there's been some real developments in the last generation.
You know, one of my favorite quotes in your book, you quote Obama, who says, and I'll just say it specifically here, what makes a man is not the ability to have a child, but it's the courage to raise one. And that really struck a chord with me. And I feel like that's something, when we think about sort of what it means to be a father these days, those statistics are also changing. When you compared in the 60s to today, the amount of hours that men are putting into the family household chores and duties outside of work, that is continuing to increase. Nowhere near women. It's like 17 hours, I think you said, for men and 35 hours for women, so per week, which again, it's just moving in the right direction from like 2 or 3 hours back in the days of, you know, the 60s. And so we're seeing sort of a transformation as more men are stepping into more of the household duties, more of the chores, and spending more quality time with their kids.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it goes from I think in the 1970s, dad spent an average of about 5 minutes quality time with their kids a day. You know, it's gone up. I think it's about half an hour a day. But, you know, it's you know, it's getting there, and they're much more present around the house. You know, increasingly, I think marriages tend to feel like partnerships in the kind of truest sense of the term, and that's a sort of direction which seems to be getting closer and closer. You know, if you look at younger people coming through now, So Matt, we aren't these kind of emotional oafs anymore. Men do get a very bad rap, but I think we are generally learning to become better fathers and better partners and more supportive, and that's got to be a good thing. So amidst the kind of doom and gloom and those statistics, I think we can pat ourselves on the back for having evolved a little bit.
Well, it's funny too, because what we're seeing, I mean, I'm a father of two young boys. I've got a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old, so I guess not that young anymore. But I distinctly remember when I was a child at this age, I was sneaking around with my Playboys and penthouses and sort of sharing it with my friends. And I'm curious sort of what you see now when you have the prolific amount of porn in your pocket, and both my children have mobile phones that they can at any point go to YouPorn or Pornhub or any other free porn websites. It's not just about seeing these nude pictures. It's about really explicit sexual content that oftentimes, people used to have to dream about or think about or experience in their minds. Now they're seeing just about anything they could possibly imagine in video format. So what sort of advice or support do you have for fathers who are out there trying to support their children and helping them grow up, and at the same time are inundated with an entirely new generation of things like pornography that is always 24 hours, 7 days a week available to their kids, and there really isn't a way to stop them from experiencing a lot of that content?
No, I think you just need to become Amish. I think you just got to electricity, phones. Yeah, they were nice, but we can do without them.
They've had a good run.
Yeah, that's fine. We can retire progress now. Gosh, I mean, if there's a genie to put back in the bottle, I have to say it is the pornography that's prevalent today. I mean, I was writing about my experience of being on porn sets for a BBC documentary I was making, and how what you might mistakenly you have thought was empowering was anything but. It was just abusive for all concerned. And like you, back in the day, I might there might have been a magazine that got passed around school at lunchtime, which was it was just a frenzy. It was like a in your terms, an American football scrum or a rugby scrum, like 30 kids on top of each other. Let me see. What do you got? If you manage to rip a piece of boob off or something, that was about as good as your year got. So, I despair now for if you've got boys and girls. I think maybe a home electronic jammer that stops the internet. I don't know. I mean, I just think as a parent, all you can do is just have a really honest conversation to them and point it out, because that's something which we're just not wired to be able to deal with. Our brains, the dopamine hits of seeing this stuff and the rewiring, it's really not a great look. Maybe give your kids some retro Playboys for their birthday.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see that. I was thrilled that my oldest son had sort of discovered Dungeons and Dragons, which, in my age, back when I was a kid, that's where the kids got stuffed in lockers, and you would have been fearful of bullying of someone who's basically playing something like Dungeons and Dragons. But what I realized was he's got a group of friends that are willing to sit down at a table, roll some dice, play some games, and use their minds and imagination. So I was all for it and very much supportive of him having his D&D down in the basement and playing as much as he wanted with his friends, because it was off the machines and it was allowing them to basically use their imaginations, try to come up with strategy and other things like that. So I completely support the concept of board games or things that get their kids off the devices and playing with other kids.
He says he's playing D&D. He sat with his friends watching porn as we speak. So,
I'm sure there's some breaks.
I think I'm rolling some dice down here. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so, I mean, just staying on that for one more point, and then we'll move on from this topic. But the interesting thing for me also that you mentioned is this idea of how do you as a father, you really support the development of your kids when every answer they could ever seek is on a device in their pocket 24
Mm.
hours a day, 7 days a week? So even outside of pornography, it's really just sort of, continuously trying to instill values in your children and support them in their growth when they have this access to unlimited information, insights, which may or may not be accurate, but it's certainly on the internet, so it's often quoted.
Yes. I mean, I guess, how much of that growth can be based on experience? There are certain things that you can't, get online, and that is, without sounding too twee, going with your dad to a ball game, or going camping. It's kind of tapping back into the things which we've done throughout time, where father, son, or family bonding has come from. And, that's being outside, that's being in nature, that's doing things together, that's having when your kid looks back and says, what were the experiences? And it's like, well, it's going to be that camping trip that went wrong. It's going to be there for when your team won, one of the big cups or lost them. It's not going to be when you gave them the great answer that Google, also corroborated. So, I think it's about almost being a bit analog with kids and saying, boys especially are still wired to run around. They're kind of like feral animals.
Yes.
They need to run. They're wired that way. Is a different way of learning, a kind of more kinetic, hands-on way of learning, of doing stuff, of building something together, and not just kind of talking to your son whilst you're both looking over screens, or not all the time. Let's be realistic. I think it's about how can you build on those kind of really rich, sort of tangible experiences together.
I love that. I love that sort of perspective and this idea of having these analog experiences as support for growth and development. I mean, we know that boys naturally want to climb trees and they want to go out there and be rough and tumble. And there's that stuff that's built into their DNA. Having camping trips and having the ability for kids to start fires and sort of understand a controlled environment, obviously, but being able to be in that place where they can be a little dangerous allows them to express other aspects of themselves that they're not going to be able to experience on machines. So I love those examples. Those are really great.
Yeah. And, there's something I think called a risk thermostat, where kids, when they climb a tree and they get halfway up and they realize, uh-oh, I'm in trouble, they set their own risk levels there. Whereas if you say, well, never climb a tree, don't climb a tree, they've not had that learning experience. And, obviously without kind of sending your kids up giant trees, it's there was something about the rough and tumble of a pre-digital childhood which served the kid in better ways, and also even like we learn more about the microbiome and the gut and how important that is to physical and mental health, and just getting your hands dirty and in mud and soil is good for your gut as well. So basically what I'm saying, brothers, lock your kids outside and make them live in the tree.
Go back to the old days when you and I grew up, where just be home by dinner. That was like the whole thing. Go get on your bike and go do something outside with your friends. Well, so sort of staying on this too, one of the other really interesting points that you make in the book, which I really appreciate, is automation and the massive amount of job loss that not only that we've already experienced, but that we are poised to be experiencing in the next 5 to 10 years. And so as men have historically seen themselves as the breadwinners in the family unit, we're now seeing that the highest, fastest growing industries are predisposed to promoting women. And so not only is the pendulum swinging in terms of that dominance of males at the top, we're starting to see some changes there, but what we're really seeing is hyper growth in industries where they're predominantly favoring women over men. So I'm really curious, with two boys that are about to go into college and thinking about sort of what their next career moves are, I'm really curious from your perspective is to where do men get to be men in this age of automation, and where are the opportunities that they should be pursuing at this stage, knowing what we see about how much automation is going to impact the overall industry?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the traditional, quote, manly jobs are thin on the ground already and disappearing, despite the president's promises. I'm not sure coal is going to come back.
There's very few people I think who actually believe that, but they're the same ones who voted. So who knows, right?
So, those blue collar jobs are getting fewer and far between, and people who drive for a living as well. So, those blue collar jobs, not driving, but, the kind of rough and tumble jobs,
right?
I guess had that sort of traditional manly quality, whereas the areas which are growing, I guess there are two things. One is that the areas which are growing, men might look down on as jobs, and maybe that's something we need to address, where they're kind of caring professions. You've got a very aging population.
Yes.
Those nurturing and caring jobs, which have traditionally been female, men maybe need to kind of get over that stigma and be willing to embrace more traditionally female jobs. But, to the point of your kids and stuff, it's like, well, how would you, I guess it's sort of second guessing, what are the jobs which are safest from automation, and how can they go into that? And that's a really good question. And then beyond that, if you're, there's the kind of work thing, and there's the how do you engage your masculinity thing, which is, if you're not going to get that from your job, and most of us don't already, and that's shrinking, I guess it's things, it is things like sports and learning a skill and martial arts. And there's something about being physically productive, which seems to make men very happy. So
Yes.
Guys who do skilled jobs, your painters, your decorators, plumbers, are twice as likely to be as extremely happy as those of us that work in offices. There's something about, I've built something and here's a tangible end product. And if you're not going to get that through your work, then what can you do in your wider life? What's the hobby? What's the skill that you're learning at the weekends, where you have that sense of pride of, oh, I just finished that and I feel really proud, which, you might get in a sport or mastering a martial art or whatever it is. But I just think, we like to be productive as men. So how can you find that physical productivity if you're not getting it at work?
It's funny you say that too, because I started my journey into martial arts in college, and 25 years later, I am a fourth degree black belt master instructor for Subakdo Muda Kwan, and about to test for my 5th degree black belt. And I will tell you definitively, as you've explained, that was one of the things that kept me sane when, through all the office politics and all the craziness at work, the ability to be physical and spar, or, really work out and really sweat it out or hit the punching bag or any of those things, gave me an outlet for those charges of masculinity where I wanted to direct it in the positive ways. And so I can speak very authentically to what you're saying in terms of how something like martial arts or a sport or something outside of work can really help the drive, where you can have a very positive outlook for masculinity, and not in a place that's going to be destructive or show up in the wrong places inappropriately at work.
I didn't realize I was looking into the eyes of a killer.
Well, the beautiful thing is, I'll tell you the truth. Since I've got my black belt, I've never had to fight. And what's interesting about that eyes of the killer statement is, it's really interesting because you can stare people down in situations when they know that you have no fear. It's kind of terrifying. And so what's interesting about it is the handful, maybe 2 or 3 times that in the last 25 years, I've come into situations that may have resulted in a fight. We didn't have to fight because there was just a calm coolness that is almost like, a sociopath, where you're not afraid of getting into a fight. And I didn't do it. I didn't have to fight, thank God. But at the same time, that feeling of that is part of what drives that masculine side of our beingness. And I loved it.
Yeah. And all the men watching this are like, I want to be that guy.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to be able to just stare the guy down in the bar without fear. So
and it's true, but that's the thing, is like, if you don't know how to fight, a situation where 2 people look like they're about to get in a fight is terrifying. I've been on the other side of that as a kid growing up. I got beat up 2 or 3 times in junior high and grade school. And it was terrifying because I didn't know what I was doing, and I just got pummeled. And the other side of that, knowing exactly what to do, and like knowing that no matter what this person throws at me, I have been trained for years on how to handle myself, and it's not going to be too bad. Yeah, I might take some few punches, but I'm not going to like go to the hospital. And that's like, knowing that certainty, you're willing to step into those situations and fight for what's right. It's really great. So
You are the archetype of the modern male. We found you.
Woohoo! I'm here! Yay! Well, no, I'll say one other thing too is that the facing fears. One of the things you talk about in your book, which I really, really appreciate, is this idea of stretching yourself. When hunting the woolly mammoths 10,000 plus years ago, men would go out there, throw their spears, and feel like they're in the hunter phase. There's real risk involved. It's similar to the climbing the tree. I'll tell you, one of the reasons that I really got into public speaking was facing that fear of standing up in front of a crowd of whether it's hundreds or thousands of people. The ability to do that was able to sort of face a fear that I liken to what the thrill of hunting might have been. Now, of course, I've never done that, but I'll tell you the public speaking side. There are times when it's very, very freaky when somebody asks you a question you don't know, or your PowerPoint slide breaks and now you're sort of just up there with hand puppets. I mean, there's these situations that are unforeseen that also sort of allow you to step into your strength and know that you're enough in that moment. And that to me is part of that journey of masculinity being put in the right way. So I'm curious.
And you do have that sort of spike in adrenaline and you feel slightly high afterwards, assuming it goes well. If it doesn't go well, you kind of crash and curl up on the couch for a week. Which gets to, I think, how our adrenal system is wired. And we are wired to have these short bursts of adrenaline or cortisol, really, where that lion appears and it's like flight, fight, freeze, body flooded with the necessary hormones to kind of get you away. But in our modern life, we're being flooded with these hormones in a completely different way, where there's a threat not to your survival, but maybe a threat to your status or your income. And it's someone you're not getting on with at work, or a boss who's a bit of a dick. And, seeing them in the office causes your, cortisol to rise, but doesn't sort of spike in that healthy way and come back down.
Right.
It sort of just like keeps pumping out. And that's really harmful for the body. So I guess when you're doing your public speaking or sometimes martial arts, it's like, how do I get that good spike of adrenaline, which is how I'm wired, rather than this sort of adrenaline that's chugging out, that's almost like leaking into your system. And again, it's something, when you do these kind of high intensity exercise and you're giving it all you can for a short period of time, that's kind of regulating the chemicals in your body. And I was speaking to a chap from Harvard last week who about exercise, and when you are exercising intently, your brain actually grows in size, as well as your ability to recall things and releasing feel-good chemicals and the hugging chemical and endorphins and all that sort of stuff. And that's kind of how we're wired. We're wired for these short bursts of adrenaline, running after an animal, running away from one, getting out of danger. What we're not wired for is sitting in an open plan office with a passive aggressive boss and colleagues you're not sure whether you like or not.
Well, and to that point, a passive aggressive boss who also controls your financial income. I mean, that's the other thing too, is that you could have a boss that's a bit of a dick. And part of the challenge is that, you can't be the masculine man that you would like to be. If you saw that person in a bar, you might step up to him and make him back down or do something else. But in this particular situation, they have control not only over the situation in the office, but your own financial freedom. And so that's massive power, and you're conflicted between stopping that boss and stepping into that power, and also sort of allowing it to occur and allowing it simply because they control so much of your economics behind that.
Yeah, it's incredibly emasculating because at their behest is your income and your status and your hunter gathering. So you end up having to kind of like, send these awful emails like, it's a really good point, maybe I just think that, or, I hope you're well. You don't hope so. You don't care if they live or die, frankly. So it's incredibly emasculating, and to go back to the time of the Civil War, 9 out of 10 guys were self-employed. They were small farmers, they were artisans, they were shopkeepers. They didn't have these obsequious relationships with bosses, or if you're in the gig economy, it's like, oh, please can I have 5 stars but have them drive me around, or I'll work overtime. You know, they don't have these kind of awful relationships where we're having to slightly beg the whole time or bite our lips. They were men because they had freedom, and freedom is one of the kind of classic male traits. That's why the myth, as it was really, of the cowboy was invented long after cowboys had disappeared, because guys were going to work in factories, being turned into kind of human robots, completely emasculated, and then dreamt about freedom. And that freedom was the kind of rugged cowboy archetype. You know, in the same way, I think I was writing that the equivalent for us is kind of conjuring up a kind of Don Draper.
Yes.
You know, we kind of lionize this, or fascinated by this kind of era when men were men in the office and got away with murder, compared to being in an open plan office now. And, you know, they would write the day off and go on a drinking bender.
But that's just it. I mean, so there are many things from that time would allow you to buy a house and put your kids through college and have plenty of money left over. You know, they're essentially making, you know, we're making about a fourth of what they were making at that time, based on some of the things that you shared in your book. And I think about that dual incomes today are the norm, and the single income families are the exception. And the dual incomes don't even equate to what that one income would have made in the 60s and early 70s. So we really have changed in all of this. And so in addition to the automation challenges, we also have just overall economics of how hard we're working for what little we're actually receiving in terms of our long-term sustainability and growth.
Yes. I mean, it's not feminism that screwed men. It's the economy and
yes.
Economic inequality and fairness. You know, when we are, you know, compared to our father's generation, you know, they're at least twice as well off as us. You know, we are slaves to this economy, and you know, one of the greatest things that would help then is just a kind of fairer economic distribution. Yes. You know, where the guys at the top could maybe share a bit more of the pie around, and so yeah, no, it's really. You know, someone, you know, said to me, "Oh, you know, so was it women that stole your spear?" Because the book in England is called "Who Stole My Spear?"
Yeah,
and I said, "No, it was the economy. You know, the economy that's done this in." And you know, what you do see, you know, in Scandinavia, when you have a flatter social structure where the gap between the rich and the poor is much narrower, and there's, you know, fabulous provision of social security, you know, it's free healthcare, free education, great paternity and maternity leave, all that sort of thing, and where being a show-off is actually frowned upon, you have, you know, what are arguably the happiest societies in the world, and that's not an accident.
Beautiful. Tim, I want to thank you so much. Tim Samuels, his book, Future Man, How to Evolve and Thrive in the Age of Trump, Mansplaining, and Me Too Movement. Tim, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate all of your insights. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Bill, it's been a pleasure. I'm now moving to Denmark, and I think you should check up to see what your boys are really doing.
That sounds like a good plan. I'll do that. Thank you so much, sir. Take care.
Thank you.